My parents gave my booked wedding venue to my sister because her guests are more important. I smiled and let her have it. Then I moved my wedding to a place they could never compete with. When my mom saw the invitations, she called me 14 times before noon. I had the vineyard booked for 8 months before any of this happened. Not a tentative not a we're thinking about it conversation with an events coordinator. A signed contract, a non-refundable deposit that took me 4 paychecks to save for, a tasting menu I'd picked course by course over 2 separate visits, chairs counted down to the exact number, place cards half designed on my laptop in a folder labeled "Wedding, do not touch." I run operations for a mid-sized logistics company. My whole job is anticipating the ways a plan can fail before it fails, building in buffers, making sure that when something goes wrong, there's already a version 2 ready to go. I planned my wedding the same way I plan a supply chain: redundancies, contingencies, a binder. None of that prepared me for my mother asking me to come over for just a quick dinner on a Tuesday and then sliding a folder across her kitchen table like she was closing a business deal. I want to explain the folder first, because the folder tells you everything about how my family runs. It had a printed copy of my venue contract inside it, which meant she'd asked me to email it to her months earlier under the pretense of wanting to see how nice the place was, and had kept it. It had a second document, freshly printed, still warm from her home printer, which was a formal request to the venue to transfer the booking to my sister's name. It had a sticky note on top in her handwriting that just said, "For her, talk tonight." I hadn't even sat down yet when she started talking. "Your sister's guest list is different from yours," she said. "Her fiance's family is flying in. There are people on that list who matter for his career, for the family's reputation, for things bigger than one afternoon. Your friends will understand if you scale down. They're not going anywhere." I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I don't think anger is actually what showed up first. What showed up first was a strange, cold clarity, the kind you get when you're driving and you see the accident about to happen half a second before it happens. I understood sitting at that table that this conversation had already been decided somewhere else, in some other room, without me, and that I had been brought in only to be informed, not consulted. My sister was 26. I was 31. We'd never been close in the way people mean when they say sisters are close. We weren't calling each other every week, we weren't each other's best friends, but I'd never actively disliked her either. She'd always been the one people paid attention to first. Louder, funnier at parties, better at making a room feel like it revolved around her. I'd made my peace with that a long time ago. I told myself it didn't bother me. Sitting at that table, watching my mother slide a folder toward me like a merger agreement, I realized how much of my peace had actually just been quiet resignation wearing pieces clothes. To understand why I didn't argue, you have to understand what arguing in my family actually costs. My mother doesn't fight the way most people fight. She doesn't raise her voice. She doesn't slam doors. She reframes. If you push back on something she's decided, she doesn't get defensive. She gets patient, almost sorrowful, like she's watching you make a mistake she already warned you about. She'll say things like, "I just want what's best for the family," or "I'm the one who has to think about how this looks for everyone, not just you." And within about 90 seconds, the conversation stops being about whatever you originally objected to and becomes about your character, your selfishness, your inability to see the bigger picture. I'd watched this pattern my whole life, mostly aimed at other people, and I'd told myself I was smart enough to see it coming and immune to it. I was wrong about the second part. I wasn't immune. I'd just learned, slowly and mostly unconsciously, that the fastest way to end one of these conversations without losing something I actually cared about was to concede early, before the reframing machinery even got started. My father is a different kind of participant in all this. He's not a bad man. He's just profoundly, chronically absent from anything that requires him to disagree with my mother in front of other people. He works in commercial insurance. He golfs on Saturdays, and when family conflict arises, he tends to develop a sudden, urgent need to check on something in the garage. He wasn't at that Tuesday dinner. I don't think that was an accident. My sister, for her part, had spent her whole life absorbing the lesson that wanting something loudly enough and wanting it in front of enough people was usually sufficient to get it. I don't say that with as much bitterness as it probably sounds like. It's just a fact about how she was raised. The same way it's a fact about how I was raised, that I learned wanting things loudly got you labeled difficult. We were raised in the same house by the same 2 people and came out with almost opposite operating instructions. She'd gotten engaged 4 weeks before that dinner. Whirlwind, by her own account. She and her fiancé, a man who worked in some capacity I never fully understood at a private equity firm, had been dating for about a year and a half, and the proposal had happened at a restaurant with a view expensive enough that I assume it was chosen specifically for how well it would photograph. Within days of the engagement, my mother had started referring to the wedding not as my sister's wedding, but as an opportunity for the family, an opportunity to be seen by the kind of people his family knew. I want to be fair to my sister here, because it would be easy to make her the villain of this story, and I don't think that's accurate. She didn't ask my mother to take my venue. As far as I can tell, she mostly just failed to say no when the idea was presented to her as a fait accompli, which is a different and smaller kind of failure than actively engineering it. She was 26 and freshly engaged and being told by our mother that a beautiful venue had become available for her wedding at no cost to her, and she took it. The way you take a gift you didn't ask for but also don't feel like refusing. My mother is the one who did the engineering. My mother is the one who called the venue's events coordinator directly, I found this out later, and asked, without mentioning that the booking belonged to someone else, whether it would be possible to update the primary contact and billing information on an existing reservation. She'd used my name and my email to originally inquire about the space, knew the account number from the contract I'd shared with her, and had a enough of my basic information memorized that the coordinator, a perfectly reasonable person doing her job, didn't think to question the request. It was only the actual contractual transfer, my signature, releasing the booking, that required my direct involvement, which is the only reason I ended up at that table at all. She needed one thing from me: my signature. Everything else she'd already arranged without asking. Sitting there, looking at that folder, I understood I wasn't actually being given a choice. I was being given the appearance of a choice, which is a very different thing, and one my family had perfected over about 3 decades of practice. The real decision had already been made. What was being asked of me was whether I would make the transition smooth or make it ugly. Smooth got me credit for being reasonable. Ugly got me a permanent reputation as the sister who caused a scene at her own sister's engagement season. I picked smooth, not because I'd forgiven anything, but because I'd already, somewhere in the back of my mind, started thinking about what smooth would let me do instead. I said okay, I said take it. I meant it in the sense that I wasn't performing calm for an audience. I actually felt calm, the specific calm that comes from already having a plan you haven't told anyone about yet. I signed the transfer that night at the table with my mother's pen. She watched me sign it with an expression I can only describe as pleasantly surprised, like she'd expected more resistance and was recalibrating her respect for me slightly upward for not providing it. My sister, when she found out later that evening, reportedly said finally and went back to whatever she was doing on her phone. I heard this secondhand from an aunt who apparently thought I'd want to know exactly how little my capitulation had registered as a sacrifice. Here's the thing nobody in my family knew, because I had never told them. Not out of some grand strategic secrecy, but simply because it had never come up in a way that mattered. My fiance's family owns land. Not land in the abstract, aspirational way people say that. Actual land. 40 acres of undeveloped coastline that has belonged to his grandmother's family since the 1940s, when his great-grandfather, a fisherman, bought it for what would now be an almost comically small sum, back when nobody wanted waterfront property that wasn't near a town. It sat mostly untouched for 3 generations. There's a farmhouse on it that hasn't been meaningfully renovated since sometime in the 80s, a few outbuildings, a long private access road with a locked gate at the public end, and then, past all of that, cliffs and tide pools and a crescent of beach that isn't visible from any public road or trail. You cannot see it from the water either, unless you know exactly where to look, because the cove curves in such a way that it's shielded from the main channel by a rock formation locals call the Knuckle. My fiancé is not a wealthy man in any conventional sense. He's a high school science teacher. He drives a 12-year-old truck. The land isn't his, it's his grandmother's, held in a family trust that's never been touched for anything commercial, and the family's general relationship to it has always been more custodial than financial. They don't talk about it much, in the same way people who grew up with something rare and constant in their lives often don't think to mention it, because it never occurred to them that it would sound remarkable to anyone else. His grandmother had brought the land up to us once before, almost a year before any of this happened, at a family barbecue on the property itself. We were sitting on the porch of the farmhouse eating corn off the cob, and she said, almost as an aside, that she'd always thought it would be nice if someone in the family got married out here someday, since nobody had done it in 3 generations. My fiancé and I looked at each other and gently, politely, said we didn't think we could pull it off. There was no caterer who'd ever worked the property, no venue coordinator, no existing infrastructure, no power hookups beyond what the farmhouse itself used, no cell service past the gate. Hosting anything out there meant building the entire event from nothing. Tents, generators, portable everything. A logistics problem large enough that we genuinely didn't think 2 working people with day jobs could manage it in any reasonable time frame. We said maybe someday. We meant probably not. Sitting in my car in my mother's driveway that night, still holding the folder she'd made me take home for my records, I called my fiancé and told him what had happened. I expected him to be angrier than he was. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, in a tone I want to describe as amused rather than bitter, "So we don't need the vineyard anymore. We don't have a venue anymore," I said. "We have 40 acres, he said. "We just never thought we could use them." We called his grandmother that same night. She answered on the second ring, which for a woman in her 80s who mostly uses her phone to call her sister felt significant, like she'd been half expecting the call for a year. When we explained what had happened, not in detail, just the broad strokes, that the other venue had fallen through under complicated family circumstances, she didn't ask a single follow-up question about the complications. She just said, "Well, it's about time somebody used the place for something happy," and started talking through logistics like she'd already thought them through months ago and had just been waiting for us to ask. That was the moment the actual plan started. Not out of spite, not yet. At that point it was still just relief. The specific relief of realizing a door you'd assumed was closed was actually just unopened. The spite came later, once the logistics were underway, and I had enough time sitting in traffic or lying awake at 2 in the morning to really turn over what my mother had done and why she'd felt so comfortable doing it. What I kept coming back to was this: she had never once considered that I might have a resource she didn't know about. In her mental model of our family, she held all the leverage, because she'd always held all the leverage. The trust fund for the wedding costs, the social connections, the sense of what counted as impressive and what didn't. It had never crossed her mind that the quiet daughter with the unremarkable schoolteacher fiancé might be sitting on something her carefully cultivated Rolodex of country club acquaintances couldn't touch. I decided, somewhere around day 3 of planning, that she wasn't going to find out until it was too late to do anything about it. 12 days. That's how long it took to turn 40 acres of undeveloped coastline into something that could reasonably host 120 people for an evening. I want to walk through some of it, not because every detail is dramatically necessary, but because I think the sheer amount of quiet, unglamorous effort involved is part of why what happened later felt so satisfying. This wasn't luck. Nobody handed this to us. We built it, in secret, around our actual jobs, in less than 2 weeks. The first call was to my fiancé's cousin, who does event design professionally for a firm that mostly handles corporate galas and the occasional very high-end wedding. She flew in on 4 days' notice, walked the property with a legal pad and a drone, and by the end of the first afternoon had a full site plan where the ceremony would sit relative to the tide line, where a reception tent could go without disturbing the tide pools his family had always been careful about, where a generator bank could be placed far enough from the ceremony site that nobody would hear it hum during the vows. The second call was to a small catering and event crew the event designer knew, a husband and wife operation who specialized in what they called remote luxury, weddings on private land, on boats, on islands accessible only by ferry. They'd done exactly this kind of job before, so they didn't blink at the lack of running water, the need for a full mobile kitchen, or the fact that the nearest paved road was 2 miles from the ceremony site. I want to be specific about the secrecy, because it wasn't paranoia. It was a genuine logistical requirement given who I was hiding this from. My mother has, over the years, built an extensive network of contacts across the local hospitality industry, on a first-name basis with events directors at practically every venue in the region. If any vendor we hired had a standard paper trail, a booking under my name, a public listing anywhere, there was a real chance it would surface in casual conversation before the wedding happened. So we set up an LLC with a name that had nothing to do with either of our last names and routed every vendor invoice through it. If you searched either of our names, it would connect to nothing. We told our respective workplaces we were taking a few personal days here and there for wedding stuff, which was true in the vaguest possible sense. My fiancé, being a teacher, had to be more careful. He couldn't just disappear for a week in the middle of a semester, so most of the coordination fell to evenings and weekends. Phone calls from his car in the school parking lot during his lunch break, emails sent at 11 at night after grading was done. The farmhouse itself needed the most work. It hadn't been used for anything beyond storage in years, and while we weren't planning to host guests inside it, we did want it usable as a staging area, a place for the catering team to work out of, a place for me to get ready before the ceremony, a place with actual electricity where phones could charge and speakers could be set up. His grandmother insisted on being involved in this part specifically. She spent 2 of those 12 days going through the farmhouse room by room with us, deciding what could stay, what needed to be cleared out, telling stories about her husband and his father as she went that neither my fiancé nor I had ever heard before, even though we'd known her for years. I remember standing in what used to be a sewing room, holding a box of photographs from the 50s, and thinking that whatever else came of this, we'd gotten something valuable out of it already, just from the 2 of us being forced to sit with her and listen. Power was the single biggest logistical problem. The farmhouse's old generator could handle basic lighting and a refrigerator, but nothing close to what an evening reception needed. We rented 2 large industrial generators positioned behind a rise in the land so the hum wouldn't carry to the ceremony site during the vows. The event designer was almost obsessive about this. She said the difference between a wedding that feels magical and one that feels like a nice tailgate is entirely whether people can hear the generators, and I believed her. Guest transport turned out to be its own small project. The property's private road had a locked gate. Good for privacy, but bad for getting 120 people to the ceremony site without a 2-mile walk. We chartered 3 small passenger vessels to ferry guests from a private dock directly into the cove, avoiding the road entirely, which kept the guest list contained and trackable, and meant nobody's GPS history would reveal a physical address anywhere. By day 10, we had a full run-through with the vendor teams. No guests, just staff walking the actual sequence of the evening, timing how long it took to get from the dock to the ceremony site, testing the sound system against the wind coming off the water, making sure the catering tent's floor plan actually worked with the natural slope of the land. The event designer stood at the ceremony site with a stopwatch and a clipboard, looking, I remember thinking, exactly like someone running a military logistics operation rather than a wedding, and I loved her a little bit for it. By day 12, it was ready. Not perfect. There were still small things we'd keep adjusting right up until the day itself, but ready enough that if you'd told me 8 months earlier this was where my wedding would happen, on land nobody outside 2 families had ever set foot on for anything but fishing and quiet afternoons, I would have laughed and said that sounded like a fantasy. It didn't feel like a fantasy anymore. It felt like the most solid, most real plan I'd ever built in my life, and my family didn't know a single thing about it. The invitations went out 2 weeks before the wedding, and they were, by design, almost aggressively uninformative. The event designer's team had designed them to look expensive without revealing anything useful. Heavy cardstock, minimal text, no venue name anywhere on the card itself. Just a date, a time, and a small insert with a QR code that linked to a private map application, generating a single-use pin drop that expired the moment it was scanned. Guests were told in a short accompanying note to expect a coastal setting, gravel roads, and shoes appropriate for uneven ground. That was the entirety of the information anyone received in advance. No address, no property name, no hint that would let anyone type a search query and land on an answer. We knew this would look strange to people used to conventional wedding invitations, and we'd thought carefully about how to frame it so the strangeness read as intentional exclusivity rather than evasiveness. The note included a line about the location being on private family land, details provided closer to the date for logistics, which was true, and which most guests seemed to take at face value, treating it as a charming eccentricity rather than a security measure. My mother's reaction came fast. 3 days after the invitations went out, I got a text from her her that read, in its entirety, "Where did the little backup venue end up being? Want to make sure I have the right info for your aunt." I read it twice, noting the little and the backup, two words doing a lot of quiet work to reframe what had happened between us as a minor inconvenience I'd resolved on my own, rather than a theft she'd orchestrated. I didn't answer. This was, I want to note, a genuinely difficult thing for me to do. My whole life, my instinct in the face of my mother's questions had been to answer them, fully and promptly, because not answering had always previously resulted in escalation. More texts, then a call, then eventually a conversation where my silence itself became the subject, rather than whatever she'd originally asked. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long moment, feeling the old reflex firing, and made myself put the phone down without responding. An hour later, a second text arrived, still performing casualness. Also, will there be enough parking? These private venues never think it through. I didn't answer that one either. A third text came that evening, and this one dropped the pretense slightly. I heard through the grapevine that your fiance's family has money. Is that true? Your sister mentioned something. I sat with that one longer than the others, partly because of how quickly the casual check-in framing had evaporated, and partly because of the specific phrase "through the grapevine," which told me my sister had been talking to someone, probably several someones, in a way that was already generating its own momentum I hadn't accounted for. 2 days after that, my aunt, the same one my mother had mentioned wanting to inform, sent a message to a family group chat commenting on how expensive the invitation card stock felt, and asking, with what I read as genuine curiosity rather than suspicion, whether we'd used a designer. I still didn't respond. I'd made a decision, somewhere around the second unanswered text from my mother, that I was going to let every question about this wedding sit completely unaddressed until the day itself, and I was going to see how long that silence could hold before something forced it open. My sister called next, which surprised me more than any of the text had, because she does not call people. She texts, and increasingly, in the months since her engagement, mostly communicates through elaborately captioned photos on social media rather than direct conversation of any kind. An actual phone call from her felt like an event. I let it go to voicemail. I want to be honest that this wasn't entirely strategic in the moment. I was in a meeting when she called, but by the time the meeting ended and I saw the missed call, I decided deliberately not to call back immediately, and instead listened to the voicemail first, twice, sitting alone in my car in the parking garage. Her message was almost 3 minutes long, which for her is practically an essay. She opened by asking, in a tone I'd describe as performing lightness over something tighter underneath, whether my fiance and I were trying to one-up her wedding, and said it would be really embarrassing for everyone honestly if our venue turned out to look nicer than the one she'd been given. She said she hoped I understood this wasn't personal, that her wedding just needed to come first, since mine is happening sooner and there's just more riding on it. Somewhere in the middle of the message, her voice caught, just slightly, on the word everyone, like she'd started to say something else and redirected mid-sentence. I've turned that small catch over in my mind more than once since. I don't fully know what she was going to say instead. I didn't call her back. I told myself, at the time, that this was because I genuinely didn't know what I'd say that wouldn't either lie about how far along our plans already were, or reveal more than I wanted to reveal yet. Looking back, I think it was also, at least a little, that I wanted her to sit in the same uncertainty she and my mother had put me in a month earlier, without any acknowledgement at all, for a while. By the end of that week, the family group chat had gone quiet in a specific way I recognized from years of watching it. Not the ordinary quiet of nobody having anything to say, but the tense, loaded quiet of people typing messages and deleting them before sending, the little typing indicator flickering on and off like a moth near a porch light. I watched it happen in real time one evening, lying in bed with my phone propped against a pillow, and felt something that I can only describe as grim satisfaction. Whatever was building on the other side of that silence, I hadn't caused it by saying anything. I'd caused it by saying nothing at all, which felt, for maybe the first time in my adult relationship with my family, like a genuinely powerful position to be in. The quiet didn't last as long as I expected. About 10 days before the wedding, my cousin, my aunt's daughter, someone I'd always gotten along with better than most of my extended family, mostly because she'd also spent her childhood being quietly overshadowed by a louder sibling, and we'd bonded over it years ago without ever fully discussing it, texted me privately outside the group chat. She said she didn't want to get in the middle of anything, but that things had gotten weird at a family lunch the previous weekend, one I hadn't been invited to and hadn't known was happening. According to my cousin, my mother had spent a good portion of the lunch talking about the wedding in a way my cousin described as fishing, not directly asking anyone what they knew, but making comments designed to draw out information, mentioning that she'd heard the venue was somewhere private, waiting to see if anyone reacted, mentioning that she'd heard my fiance's family had some land, watching faces. My cousin said my mother seemed unusually focused on it, more focused than made sense for what was ostensibly just curiosity about a family event. My sister, according to my cousin, had been quieter than usual at this lunch, which my cousin found notable because she is rarely quiet about anything. At one point, when my mother pushed a little harder on the topic, asking directly whether my sister's fiance had heard anything through my fiance's side, since apparently the two men had met once at an earlier family gathering, my sister had reportedly snapped, mildly but audibly, "Can we not make this about her wedding at my engagement lunch?" Which struck my cousin, and later struck me, as an odd thing to say defensively, since nobody but my mother had actually been trying to make it about anything. I sat with this information for a while before deciding what, if anything, to do with it. Part of me wanted to read it as evidence that my sister was starting to feel some genuine discomfort about what had happened to my venue. A flicker of conscience I could hold onto as proof she wasn't a completely willing participant in what our mother had orchestrated. Another part of me, the more suspicious part, wondered whether the discomfort was less about guilt and more about the growing possibility that whatever I'd ended up with might actually outshine what she'd taken from me, and that this possibility was becoming harder for her to sit with the closer the date got. I didn't respond to my sister's earlier voicemail. I didn't reach out to my mother. I did, however, start paying closer attention to a specific kind of risk I hadn't fully accounted for in the original planning. The risk that came not from a direct question I could simply decline to answer, but from an accidental convergence of information nobody was trying to assemble on purpose. My fiancé and I had a conversation about this risk explicitly, sitting on his grandmother's porch one evening about a week before the wedding, watching the light go orange over water neither of us could quite believe was about to be the backdrop for our ceremony. We'd built a system that assumed the threat was a deliberate active search, someone typing our names into a database, someone calling around asking direct questions. What we hadn't fully planned for was the possibility that the information could surface sideways through some unrelated connection neither of us controlled purely by coincidence. I remember saying, half joking, that the only way something like that could actually happen was if someone in my mother's orbit had some entirely unrelated professional reason to have photographed that specific stretch of coastline before, and that the odds of that were so low it wasn't worth losing sleep over. My fiancé laughed and agreed. Neither of us thought much more about it at the time. In hindsight, I think about that conversation more than almost any other part of this story, because it's the moment where we correctly identified the exact mechanism of our own eventual discovery and then dismissed it as too improbable to worry about. I don't think that was foolish exactly. It genuinely was improbable. It just turned out to be the specific improbable thing that happened anyway, which I've come to understand is usually how these things go. You can plan for the likely threats. The one that gets you is almost always the one you'd calculated as too unlikely to bother defending against. The days leading up to the wedding blurred together in the particular way that final preparation always does. Dress fittings, a rehearsal that had to be conducted partly by boat because of the tide schedule, an increasingly tense radio silence with my side of the family that I'd started to find almost peaceful, like the quiet after you finally turned off an appliance that had been humming in the background so long you'd stopped consciously hearing it. The rehearsal itself is worth describing, because it's one of my clearest memories from that entire stretch of time, clearer even than most of the actual wedding day. We'd scheduled it for early evening, time to the tide, and the small group of us, my fiancé, his grandmother, the officiant, a handful of the wedding party who'd been read into the secrecy, took one of the charter boats out to the cove just as the light was starting to go long and gold across the water. Nobody rehearsed with any real seriousness. We stood roughly where we'd stand, walked roughly where we'd walk, and mostly just stood at the edge of the tide looking at the place where, in a few days, we were actually going to do this. At some point, his grandmother pulled me aside, away from the small cluster of people going over logistics, and told me that she hadn't expected, at her age, to get to watch anyone get married on this land again. She said her own wedding, decades earlier, had happened in a church 2 towns over, nothing to do with the property at all, and that her husband had always talked about wanting one of their children or grandchildren to do it here someday, and never got to see it happen before he died. She said this without any real sentimentality in her voice, just stating it as a fact, the way she seemed to state most things, but I remember my throat tightening anyway, standing there with the tide coming in around our ankles. I didn't know, standing on that beach, how close we were to almost losing all of it to a coincidence involving a man neither of us had ever met. I had no idea during any of those final days that the mechanism of discovery my fiancé and I had joked about and dismissed was already quietly in motion, several steps removed from either of us, in a conversation neither of us was present for. The person who actually connected the dots was someone I have still, to this day, never met. The husband of one of my mother's oldest friends, a woman who'd known my mother since they were both in their 20s. Her friend's husband is a commercial photographer, and for the past several years the bulk of his work has been aerial photography for high-end real estate listings, the kind of sweeping drone shots that make a coastal property look like something out of a travel magazine. It's a small, specialized niche, and over the years he's built up a substantial personal archive of aerial footage from up and down the coast, most of it shot for one-off listing jobs and filed away afterward, sitting in his project folders indefinitely. About 14 months before any of this happened, entirely unrelated to my wedding, entirely unrelated to my family, he had been hired to shoot aerial footage of a stretch of coastline for a property appraisal. Not our property directly, but an adjacent parcel a few miles up the coast, close enough that in the course of getting his establishing shots, he'd captured several minutes of footage that included, at the edge of frame, the distinctive curve of the cove around the Knuckle Rock formation and, further inland, the shape of an old farmhouse roofline. He hadn't thought about that footage in over a year. It sat in a folder on an external hard drive labeled with the appraisal job's client name, one of hundreds of similar folders accumulated over a decade of work. What brought it back to the surface was almost absurdly small. My mother, in one of her conversations with her friend about the wedding, a conversation I wasn't present for and only pieced together afterward, secondhand, through a chain of people who each added a little more detail, had apparently shown her friend a photo of our invitation, the physical card itself, commenting on how unusually vague it was, joking that it felt like being invited to a witness protection program. Her friend, making conversation, had shown the invitation to her husband that same evening, mostly just because he happened to be in the room and she thought the design design was interesting. He looked at it for a few seconds. There was nothing on the invitation itself that would mean anything to a stranger. No address, no venue name, nothing. But there was a small design element on the back of the card, a subtle line illustration the event designer's team had added purely for aesthetic reasons. A simplified silhouette of a coastline with a distinctive rock formation jutting out from it, meant to evoke coastal wedding in a general decorative way. He had spent years staring at coastlines from directly above them for a living, and recognized the specific shape of that rock formation immediately. Not consciously, not as a deliberate act of investigation, he described it later through the chain of people who eventually told me this story as a that's funny moment, the kind of passing recognition you get when you see a face that reminds you of someone and can't immediately place who. He mentioned it to his wife almost as an aside. That silhouette on the invitation looks exactly like a formation I shot last year, up past the point. She asked what he meant, mostly out of politeness. Now curious himself, he pulled up the old project folder on his laptop right there in the living room, more to satisfy his own curiosity than for any other reason, and found the footage. He showed her the old aerial shot. She looked at it, looked at a photo of the invitation on her phone, and said something like, that is the same rock. Neither of them thought much more about it in the moment. It was a mildly interesting coincidence, the kind of thing you mention at dinner and then forget by dessert, except she did mention it at dinner. She mentioned it to my mother the very next day, over lunch, entirely innocently, as an amusing anecdote about her husband's uncanny eye for coastline. He saw your daughter's invitation and swears he's photographed the exact same spot for some real estate job last year. Small world. I want to sit with this moment for a second because I think it's important to understand that nobody in this chain, not the photographer, not his wife, was trying to uncover anything. There was no investigation. There was no suspicion driving any of it. It was an offhand comment, delivered as a charming small world story from someone who had absolutely no stake in my wedding and no idea she was handing my mother the exact piece of information I had spent weeks and a considerable amount of money trying to keep from her. My mother, however, was listening for exactly this kind of thing. In the low-grade, background way a person listens for something they've been quietly hunting for weeks, without admitting to themselves how much energy they're spending on it. The moment her friend said, real estate job, my mother's entire posture, according to her friend's own account of the lunch, changed. She asked, very casually, whether he still had that old footage. Her friend said probably, and offered, since she was going home anyway, to have him send it over. That evening, an email arrived in my mother's inbox with a compressed video file attached. 4 minutes and 12 seconds of aerial coastline footage shot 14 months earlier for a job that had nothing to do with any of us, containing at roughly the 2-minute mark an establishing shot of a rock formation known locally as the Knuckle, and drifting into frame a few seconds later as the drone banked north along the coast, the unmistakable outline of an old farmhouse roof. She watched the footage 3 times before she called anyone, according to what I eventually pieced together. The first time, just to confirm what she was looking at. The second time, pausing on the farmhouse. The third time, with a notepad, writing down the timestamp of the frame that showed the property most clearly, like she was building a case file. She recognized the shape of that farmhouse roofline immediately, and not from the drone footage alone. She'd seen it once before, in person, at a family barbecue almost a year earlier. The same barbecue, in fact, where my fiancé's grandmother had first mentioned the idea of hosting a wedding on the land. My mother had come to that barbecue mostly out of politeness, had spent most of the afternoon more interested in the corn and the potato salad than in the property itself, and had, without meaning to, filed away a detail she didn't even know she'd registered: a farmhouse, a specific, slightly crooked roofline, sitting on land she'd been told, in passing, belonged to his family, though she'd never asked exactly how much land or what it was worth, or why anyone would bother mentioning it at a barbecue in the first place. Now she knew. She pulled up the county property records that same night, searching by the family's last name, and found, within a few minutes, everything she needed. 40 acres of waterfront parcel, held in a family trust, no mortgage, purchased in the 1940s and passed down through 3 generations without ever once being sold, subdivided, or developed. She cross-referenced the parcel boundaries against the coastline in the aerial footage, and confirmed beyond any doubt that this was the same property, and that this was where my wedding was actually going to happen. I don't know exactly what went through her mind in that moment, because I wasn't there and she has never described it to me directly. But I know, from everything I understand about how she thinks, that the calculation wasn't primarily about me or about what I'd built. It was about status. The sudden realization that the unremarkable schoolteacher she'd never bothered to research any further than his job title was connected to something her entire social calculus had failed to account for. She had spent a month operating on the assumption that I'd scraped together some modest backup plan out of wounded pride, and that whatever I'd found would inevitably be smaller than what she'd handed my sister. She had never once considered that quiet people sometimes have quiet resources. My phone started ringing at 7 the next morning before I'd even had coffee. I watched it from the kitchen counter, half asleep, the screen lighting up with her name, and then going dark, and then lighting up again a few minutes later. I didn't answer the first one. I didn't answer the second. By 9, there were 9 missed calls stacked on the screen. By 11, 13. Somewhere around the 4th or 5th call, a text came through in between, which she almost never does. She prefers calling to texting, always has, says texting feels like talking to someone through a wall. The text just said, call me. No punctuation, no explanation, which from her felt almost as loud as the calls themselves. I looked at it for a second and put the phone face down on the counter. I got dressed. I made toast I didn't really want, just for something to do with my hands. I answered a work email that had been sitting in my inbox since the day day before. Something about a shipment delay that under normal circumstances would have occupied my entire morning and instead barely registered. I did not touch the phone. A second text arrived sometime around 10, longer this time. She'd apparently decided texting wasn't beneath her after all. It said something about needing to talk about logistics for the wedding, which struck me, even in the moment, as a strange word choice for a woman who 3 days earlier had referred to my venue as a little backup location she assumed didn't merit any logistics at all. I didn't respond to that one either. I set the phone on the counter and went back to the email. By 11, the missed calls had climbed to 13, evenly spaced, almost rhythmic, like she was giving herself just enough time between attempts to convince herself the next one would be the one that got through. I found myself somewhere around call number 10, almost admiring the persistence of it, the sheer refusal to consider that the silence might mean something other than a technical malfunction on my end. At 11:40, the 14th call came through. I watched it ring all the way through nearly to the end, the little animation of her contact photo bouncing gently with each buzz against the counter. And then, right before it would have gone to voicemail like all the others, I picked up. I didn't say hello. I didn't say anything at all. For a long moment, all I could hear on the other end was her breathing.